Good morning and welcome to Trevor Phillips on Sunday and to a crisis that has pitched two great British institutions, the BBC and the royal family, into a confrontation that could change both for good. When Princess Diana spoke to the BBC's Martin Bashir 25 years ago, none of the watching millions could mistake her anger. We now know that the interview was obtained by deceit, and her son, the future king, says that it was the BBC's lies which led to her bitterness. Mr Bashir now says that he is deeply sorry. But the BBC faces yet more questions, not least because for 25 years its bosses knowingly covered up Bashir's lies and then gave him a new job. In just a moment, we'll be speaking to the Home Secretary Priti Patel. Her Labour shadow, Nick Thomas-Symonds, joins us from Cardiff. Princess Diana's most famous and authorised biographer, Andrew Morton, tells us what he thinks was in the princess's mind. And we'll ask one of Britain's most revered TV journalists, former head of news and current affairs at Channel 4, Dorothy Byrne, whether the corporation can ever rebuild trust. And finally, as if he could ever be an and finally, I'll be speaking to Jeremy Corbyn's Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, about what Labour needs to do to compete again. First up, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. Good morning, Home Secretary. Thank you for joining us. Before we turn to the announcements that you want to make on immigration, can we spend a moment on the revelations about the BBC? Lord Dyson, the Duke of Cambridge, the Duke of Sussex, and now many of the BBC's own journalists have called the national broadcaster's integrity into question. Do you personally trust the BBC?
Well, I think it's important to recognise the criticism and the deep concern associated with the report that was published by Lord Dayton. The BBC itself, one of our great institutions, its reputation has been compromised. It's being questioned right now. And they themselves will have to reflect upon the report and spend a great deal of time, I think, really looking at how they can regain and rebuild trust and confidence. Confidence and trust of the British public, but also they are a world-class institution. So they will have a great deal of work to do in this particular area. And of course, right now, it's a very, very important time for the BBC to very much look at itself and learn some very important and significant lessons post the publication of this report.
But the word I'm not hearing in answer to my question, do you personally trust the BBC, is yes. Can you say yes?
Well, absolutely. At this stage, we are focused, and even from a personal perspective, I'm very conscious of the hurt, the damage that this report has highlighted. And on that basis, Trevor, you've already heard me say, I think the reputation of the BBC has been compromised. There's no question about that. Trust and confidence has been undermined. And now is the time for the BBC to absolutely reflect upon the findings of this report and rebuild that trust and confidence.
I'm hearing a no there, and I'm wondering if what that means is that you think that the BBC cannot go on marking its own homework after Jimmy Savile, after Cliff Richard, now after this thing. Do you think, like, for example, Lord Grade, that we need some new way of holding the corporation to account? For example, he's proposed a new board of editorial policy composed of experienced, independent journalists.
Well, I think there will be a review point, Trevor. Next year is an opportunity when it comes to the mid-term review of the BBC Charter for government and the BBC to absolutely look at new ways of governance of the institution, the organisation that is the BBC. So my colleagues, I know the Culture Secretary in particular, will be working with the BBC to very much use that moment as an opportunity, and I say this as an opportunity, to review governance and accountability structures. And post this report, that's going to be a very, very important moment.
Some of this does come into your wheelhouse, doesn't it? The Metropolitan Police are saying that though they looked at this in March, the Dyson report has caused them to look at the situation again. Do you rule out the possibility of criminal prosecutions?
Well, Trevor, it's not for me at this early stage to even speculate and comment on anything of that nature. Clearly, investigations, if they are taking place, that has to go through the process. But fundamentally right now, I come back to very much from a government perspective, there will be an opportunity specifically on the governance of the BBC, where there will be an opportunity not only for reflection, but an opportunity to look at governance reforms and how effectively accountability and governance can be strengthened. There will be a very, very significant moment now, there's no question about this, where lessons have to be learned. Yes, within the BBC itself, yes, with the leadership of the BBC, it's journalists and people that work for the BBC too. But ultimately, the governance and accountability that ultimately would lead to public trust, public confidence in the way in which the BBC operates and the way in which it conducts its business.
But you talk about this being an early moment, and I understand that. But what I take you to be saying to the Metropolitan Police and its boss, Cressida Dick, that if they find a reason to proceed with any criminal prosecutions, there will be no pushback from the Home Office if that is their judgment.
Well, look, I'm not, Trevor. It's not for me to even contemplate or speculate anything in that.
I'm not asking you to speculate. I'm simply asking you. I'm simply asking you to confirm what you've already said, I think.
Well, I think it's important right now to reflect upon findings of the report and any other information that comes out that is associated specifically with what has happened. And of course, if there is subsequent action that needs to be taken, then clearly, alongside the publication of this report, lessons being learned and changes to the institution, structure, governance, accountability, then that will follow. From a government perspective, I should just emphasise again, obviously, there'll be a mid-term review of the Charter next year, and my colleagues in government will absolutely ensure that that is used as the right opportunity, not just for reflection, but to enhance governance and accountability within the BBC.
OK, the BBC's on notice. Let's just have a quick word, if I may, on the vaccine situation. Public Health England say this morning that the vaccines we're using in Britain are effective against the Indian variant. Is that news that means that we can look forward to reopening on June the 21st?
Well, I think, Trevor, we should all really just look at the success of the vaccine programme and how that is gradually enabling us all to live our lives. The reopening of society, unlocking of aspects of our economy, clearly that's exactly what the roadmap is all about. And the Prime Minister himself has been clear that there are key tests and key stages in the run-up to the 21st of June. We will always continue to look at the data when it comes to the next stage of the roadmap. That is sensible, that is responsible. And I think we should absolutely just reflect upon the success of the vaccine and how that is giving people, individuals, society, businesses confidence to be back out there again. What is a very critical time, a year after lockdown and very tough decisions that have been made by the government. So maybe two cheers across the nation for that. Let's turn to an area for which you are directly responsible, and that is immigration. You and the Prime Minister regularly remind us that we now have control of our own borders. So why are you planning to spend time and resource on new legislation? Well, these are important changes, Trevor, around the UK's approach to immigration. And it is correct, the Prime Minister rightly, and I speak about, this is absolutely part of our manifesto commitments to take back control of our borders. And we've done that by ending free movement, that was part of leaving the EU, but also introducing a new points-based, a British points-based immigration system. That's one important aspect of legal migration, dealing with legal migration and how we have our rules in place, how we also support the brightest and the best to come to the United Kingdom to bolster our economy and support businesses in terms of their own economic growth. What I'm unveiling and proposing tomorrow is a new legal migration and border strategy, which very much sets the framework for the future, which is based upon digitalisation of our borders, but also the simplification of our immigration laws. Currently, thus far, we've already simplified something like 21 immigration routes, and we're in the process of simplifying almost 500 pages of immigration legislation and rules. And there is so much more that we can do in this whole area, and that's effectively what I will be announcing tomorrow.
Home Secretary, I understand why you're focusing on simplification and technology and so on and so forth, but in what way will new electronic gates at airports stop boats crossing the Channel to Kent or people hiding in lorries?
Well, there are two. So, Trevor, there are 2 points to make here. First of all, digitalisation is absolutely important because we can upstream checks, we can do checks on individuals before they even arrive in our country, and
but
that's important in terms of criminality.
Are not presenting themselves to be checked.
I will come on to that in a minute. I'm also, when it comes to illegal migration, so the digitalisation is speaking about legal immigration. Illegal migration is a very, very important problem and issue for our country. It has been an issue for decades and decades, whether it's the back of lorries or people crossing the Channel in very, very dangerous circumstances, being facilitated by criminal gangs and people smugglers. I am introducing the new Borders Bill, which will come to Parliament next month, where we will specifically clamp down and tackle the problems around illegal migration. We are going to change our laws. We will have not just greater checks. We've already got very, very significant law enforcement operations taking place in France, in Belgium, upstream. And we're already prosecuting and arresting the people smugglers. Last Wednesday, I myself saw a number of arrests of people that had been trafficking and facilitating people. Yeah. But the key point to make, Trevor, is that when it comes to claiming asylum, and we are going to change our asylum laws and our asylum system because it's broken, people that are being smuggled, they should be claiming asylum in a safe country, the first safe country that they travel through. More often than not, these are EU member states, rather than taking the risk of coming to the United Kingdom. And so we are going to be proposing legislation. I've made the announcements already. We've published our new plan for immigration, which tackles this very issue, illegal migration, people trafficking.
OK, Home Secretary, let's get this in perspective. Since the beginning of the year, I think that you have deported something like 700 foreign criminals. But according to the Pew Research Organisation, there are something like 800,000 to 1 million undocumented migrants in this country. And that, I think, is probably what most people are worried about, how you deal with that. And the proposals you make don't address that at all. And let's take a case in point. 10 days ago, in Glasgow, the Borders Agency, Border Force, attempted to remove 2 Indian men from Pollock Shields because they'd overstayed their visas. A large crowd gathered. They blocked the road, completely peacefully, by the way, I should say. And in the end, the Border Force gave up. And the men are still here. What are you going to do about that?
Well, Trevor, you're exactly making the case as to why we need to reform our immigration system.
But the reform you're proposing has nothing to do with this.
It actually does. So the reforms I'm proposing cover legal migration and illegal migration. So you mentioned, for example, the number of people, foreign national offenders. These are high-harm criminals, people that have committed all sorts of atrocities against British citizens in the United Kingdom. Yeah. We will continue to remove those individuals. And in fact, part of the proposals that I am bringing forward will make it easier for us to remove foreign national offenders. So we will stream. So if I may,
explain to me what you're going to do about the 2 gentlemen in Pollock Shields.
I will in just a minute. So we will also be changing many of the appeals processes where individuals go to court again and again and again to thwart our ability as a government to remove high-harm individuals or people that have overstayed their right to be in the country or who have come to the United Kingdom illegally. So immigration enforcement, and not Border Force, it's immigration enforcement in Glasgow, they were stopped from removing 2 people that had no legal basis to be in the United Kingdom. They were doing their job. The protesters stopped that from happening in terms of the removing those 2 individuals. There is a whole process around the removal of people that should not be in this country at all, people that are here illegally. So we will continue to strengthen our laws to enable the government to remove people with no legal basis to be here. That includes foreign national offenders and criminals and people that have come here illegally.
You're going to have another go at removing these gentlemen. What do you think the First Minister is going to say, because 10 days ago, she tweeted, the Home Office needs to ask itself hard questions after today. Doing this on Eid in the heart of our Muslim community and in the midst of a serious COVID outbreak was staggeringly irresponsible, but the even deeper problem is an appalling asylum and immigration policy. Are you going to confront Nicola Sturgeon on this question?
Well, the point about our immigration policy, immigration is a reserved matter for the government here. And quite frankly, it's pretty clear that when it comes to the nationalists in Scotland, they would much rather have an immigration policy of open borders, no checks when it comes to criminals coming to the UK, and no border controls. And I think actually her comments also reflect upon the nationalist position when it comes to removing people that have no legal basis to be in the UK. This is nothing to do with Eid at all. Immigration enforcement are absolutely doing their job in terms of removing people with no legal basis to be in the UK. I think it's absolutely a sorry state of affairs that we see the nationalists in Scotland basically trying to thwart the safety and security of the British public, but also trying to prevent the British government from removing those with no legal basis to be in the United Kingdom. This is, Trevor, exactly the reason why we are changing our laws and bringing in new legislation so that the government can remove people that should not be in our country while protecting the safety and security of British citizens through the legal routes and the digitalisation that I'm proposing.
I look forward to returning to this with you, Home Secretary. But before we finish, can I briefly return to a topic that's very much on your in tray, and that is the Windrush compensation scheme, where the Home Office has reported that 21 individuals have died before their cases could be processed. You also predicted that you should have paid out at least £120 million to victims of this scandal by the end of March this year. In fact, you've only paid out around £14 million. Do you feel in any way ashamed at the way your department has treated these people?
Well, I think, first of all, Trevor, when it comes to the Windrush scandal, and it was a scandal, there is a very, very significant report published by Wendy Williams, and based on the lessons learned from that scandal, we're actually implementing the recommendations from Wendy and the changes that she put forward, and that report came out last March. I've been clear to my department that those reforms are coming, they're in place, but you specifically asked about the compensation scheme. Now, it is
what I asked about was how you felt. Did you feel ashamed about what has happened?
Windrush scandal has been an absolute stain, quite frankly, on our country, but also on what has happened in the Home Office. I've been very public about that, and I will reiterate that and I'll restate that, but it doesn't mean that we ignore what has happened. So there have been a whole range of changes that have taken place, but you specifically asked about compensation. Now, first of all, the compensation scheme was designed in consultation with members of the Windrush community and the generation themselves, members of that generation. In December, so just 5 months ago, because the scheme was simply too slow and complicated in terms of bringing forward payments, I overhauled the scheme. So in the last 5 months, we have seen over £26 million of payments being put out. But also at the same time, in March, less than 2 months ago, we had our highest month where £8 million of compensation was paid out. Now, the changes to the scheme have been brought in place in conjunction with the Windrush Stakeholder Advisory Group. And I do actually want to thank everybody, because these are members of the community that have worked with me and with my department to find faster ways of streamlining payments and getting money out. But, Trevor, there is a lot more work to do here. There really is. I've been very vocal about this, and it's right that we work night and day to fix not just the compensation and get the money out, but also many of the problems that led to people involved in this actual scandal.
I get that, Home Secretary, and I hope we will have more opportunities to talk about this again. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Now, Labour has described the government's record on immigration as devoid of compassion and utterly chaotic. Let's see if the Shadow Home Secretary can tell us what Labour would do that is different and better. Here is the Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas-Symonds, in Cardiff. Nick Thomas-Symonds, you never stop criticising the government for their failures. What objection could you possibly have to an effort to make the removal of foreign national offenders quicker and more effective?
Well, clearly, people who've no right to be in this country shouldn't be here. But what we've seen from the Home Office is utter incompetence on this. And let me just take an example as well. We talk about the asylum system. The government keeps saying the asylum system is broken. They've been in power for 11 years and they broke it. If you look at 2014, 87% of asylum claims were being dealt with within 6 months. That figure had fallen to 20% by 2019. And what did the government do? They got rid of performance targets. And what we don't want to see is the government deflecting blame for their own failure when it is their incompetence, their management and mismanagement of the Home Office that's been the problem.
So Labour's solution to people coming ashore on the beaches of Kent is that there should be performance targets for civil servants?
There should be performance targets in the asylum system, but in terms of the issue of boat
and what
crossings...
they're going to wave that at the boats as they're coming ashore?
No, hang on. In terms of the English Channel, in my view, the government needs to look at a number of measures. Firstly, the long-promised agreement with France, that needs to be effective and it needs to be fully published, made available to us all. That's first, and that's a priority for the government. Secondly, the government needs to revisit its decision to abolish the Department for International Development, the very department that existed to prevent people being driven from their homes in the first place, the very department that was trying to deal with the issues that come from war, poverty and persecution. Thirdly, the government needs to look at the issue of safe routes. For example, they closed down the DUB scheme. The DUB scheme, which everyone in Parliament expected to take in 3,000 unaccompanied child refugees, was closed down prematurely after 300. That's the kind of approach the government needs to be taking, because none of us want to see people making these dangerous crossings across the Channel. OK, let's deal with a real-world situation. I asked the Home Secretary about the two men in Glasgow, and she's pretty clear. She's pretty hard line on this. They're going to go. What would Labour do? Well, look, as a general principle, people who shouldn't be in this country, people who shouldn't be here, absolutely, yes, they have to be removed. With this particular situation in Glasgow, I don't know, in terms of the particular circumstances of it, I'm not sure the due process has been observed. The Home Office doesn't have a great track record on that, I'm afraid. I think something like 55% of asylum claims succeed on appeal. So I think there has to be that guarantee on due process. And second, the whole method of immigration enforcement by the use of dawn raids is something the government has to seriously reconsider, because that particular method of enforcement isn't something clearly that is building the confidence right across the community that we need to see.
With respect, Mr. Thomas-Symonds, what you're telling me is why the government isn't doing its job. What I'd like to know is, what would you do if it is demonstrated that these gentlemen should be removed because they have overstayed? Would you, as she has promised to do, be sending the immigration enforcement people back in?
If it is shown that due process has been fully followed and people aren't entitled to stay, whether it's the two men in Glasgow or indeed anywhere else, then yes, of course, they should be removed. But the point I'm making, Trevor, around enforcement is that the particular method of enforcement that's being used here, which is this sort of dawn raid system that's being used, is not a method of enforcement that is gaining any kind of confidence from the community. There are better ways of doing things, but people who are not entitled to be here, yes, they should be removed. OK, big story today, the BBC. What do you think that the BBC, the national broadcaster, has to do to restore the public's trust, and in particular, the public who fund it? Well, fundamentally, the BBC now needs to show that what happened with the Martin Bashir interview couldn't happen again. That obtaining of an interview by deception, and we've seen the impact that's had on the royal family. You've heard Princes William and Harry talk very movingly about the impact that that has had. And then very understandably now that's raised very wide questions about ethics and about how that can be prevented from happening again. I think there's a specific question too as to how the BBC came to once again employ Mr Bashir in 2016 and how that happened. But look, the BBC makes some great programmes. The BBC still has a great reputation around the world, but it now has to rebuild trust and prove to people that what happened then couldn't happen again now.
Do you think, making Strictly and Attenborough documentaries makes up for lying to Princess Diana? Do you think that the BBC has run out of road and that now it can't continue marking its own homework, which is really the question today?
Well, look, certainly making great programmes certainly doesn't make up in any sense for what's happened here. What's happened here certainly has to be dealt with. Now, there has been a change in governance structure since back then. In those days, of course, you had the Board of Governors who, were regarded as, of course, too close to the management at the time. And there is this different structure that exists now. There is, of course, but what we need to see from the BBC now is quite openly to tell us what it is in the structure that now exists that's different that would stop that from happening and what they're going to do now to rebuild that trust.
Thank you very much, Nick Thomas-Symonds from Cardiff. Now, Andrew Morton is the journalist that the Princess of Wales handpicked to reveal her disillusion with royal life. She even gave him a nickname, Noah, short for noted author and historian. His 1992 book, Diana, Her True Story, revealed her deep unhappiness with her marriage. Few people knew her mind better, and he says that when BBC reporter Martin Bashir walked into her world, he changed it forever, but not for better. Good morning, Andrew. You were the person who, in a way, started this entire chain of events with your book. What did you make of Martin Bashir's interview in the Sunday Times this morning, in which he said, "I never wanted to harm Diana in any way, and I don't believe we did"?
Well, when I first watched the interview back in 1995, it was like watching the TV version of Diana, Her True Story. So Bashir used duplicitous means to get Diana to sit down in her sitting room and give the interview, but she was the one who owned what she had to say. So an awful lot of what she did say had been circulating before that, but because it came out of her mouth, it seemed sensational, raw and new.
Do you think that she would have done this interview anyway with somebody somewhere if she hadn't done it with Martin Bashir?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There's a queue a mile long outside Kensington Palace. Oprah Winfrey, Barbara Walters, Clive James, David Frost. The BBC had their own man, Nicholas Witchell, who had 2 meetings with her, and then Bashir swooped in and said, "I've got contacts with Earl Spencer, we're looking down a different road," and his boss said, stand back. So there's no question at all that Diana was going to speak her mind.
I think there may be an allegedly in there somewhere, Andrew, but I think that the central point I really wanted to get at is, would he have got this interview if he had not lied, or would it have gone somewhere else?
He wouldn't have got it. It's as simple as that. He scared her half to death. He had her thinking that he had contacts inside MI5. He was very plausible. He arranged meetings in underground car parks, scary places at the best of times. But when you think that your life is in danger, it was very potent. So she was put in a state of fear and trepidation, and that encouraged her to speak out. And so when she gave the interview, it wasn't a question of self-indulgence, as many people thought, but it was a question of self-preservation. She thought that she was a target. She thought that from what Bashir said, she was under the gun or in the sights of the establishment. And remember, she'd lived like this for most of her adult life.
So in a way, you're lining up with the Duke of Cambridge here, because Prince William said last week, "It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said. The interview was a major contribution to making my parents' relationship worse and has since hurt countless others." And his brother said, "The ripple effect of a culture of exploitation and unethical practices ultimately took her life." I mean, in a sense, what all three of you appear to be saying is that the manner in which Martin Bashir got this provoked a kind of, I think the word has been used as paranoia in the princess, that meant that what she then said was reflected that fear.
No, I disagree with William and Harry on this, and I do find it ironic that it's a bunch of old Etonians, including Earl Spencer, who think there's a line between the interview and Diana's death. I mean, Diana wanted to speak her truth, and she'd been stifled for a long time. So yes, she was terrified into doing the interview by Bashir, but no, what she had to say was very much reflective of what she really, truly felt. Three of us in the marriage, Queen of People's Hearts, all these things that she would have probably said these kinds of things to somebody else, Nicholas Witchell or some other journalist. It so happened that Bashir beat the pack by lying to her, and that's how he did it.
Where do you think this leaves relations between the royal family and the BBC?
Well, relations between the BBC and the royal family were at an all-time low after the Panorama interview. They really turned their backs on them, and they've been rebuilt over the years. Now, of course, when you've got these extraordinary public statements given by Prince William and Prince Harry attacking the BBC, then they've got a long way to go to restore that trust.
You're a distinguished journalist, Andrew. How does what's been revealed by this scandal leave you feeling about our trade? Well,
this is the phone tapping moment for the BBC, and remember the News of the World was involved in tapping Harry and William's phones, and that newspaper was shut down. This is a black day for British journalism, and I think that we should all reflect on how you obtain an interview and the process by which you carry it forwards.
The BBC's phone tapping moment. Thank you very much, Andrew Morton. The BBC has been publicly and furiously excoriated by the heir to the throne and is being warned by ministers that they will intervene if it doesn't do enough to restore trust with the public. We did ask the BBC to appear on this programme, but they have chosen not to. So let's bring in Dorothy Byrne, former head of News and Current Affairs at Channel 4. Dorothy Byrne, you were one of the most senior executives in British TV journalism at Channel 4 for many years. And in fact, it was Channel 4's documentary last October that started questions being asked about this whole affair once again. How serious is this for the corporation, do you think, and can it recover?
I think it's extremely serious. What has been revealed is absolutely scandalous, and it is scandalous that for more than 25 years the BBC has refused to fess up to what it did, when in fact all other television journalists have known about the faking of these bank statements for more than a quarter of a century. It's also scandalous that Martin Bashir was employed just a few years ago, ironically, as head of religion. So it is extremely serious. And actually, we as other television journalists are outraged because it has led some people to smear the whole of our profession, when in fact television journalism overwhelmingly is very tightly regulated and not at all the way that tabloid journalism behaves. Since the events 26 years ago, the BBC has become regulated independently, and I think that is absolutely key. At the time, the BBC was permitted to regulate itself, which was clearly absolutely wrong. So I think it's very serious, but we shouldn't see this as an opportunity to attack all television journalism. However, I do think that the BBC, ITV, and US networks need to look at all the other stories which Martin Bashir did.
You think that we need to go back over Martin Bashir's record and check?
Sorry, say that again.
You're saying we need to go back over Martin Bashir's record through the BBC, he's worked for ITV, I think he may have worked for Channel 4, and a couple of the US networks, and we need to look at all he's done.
Yes, I do not believe Martin Bashir ever worked for Channel 4. I would never have employed Martin Bashir. I knew all about him. Many questions, well, I didn't know all about him, I knew some about him.
You knew enough about him to say that if he'd come to you for a job, you would have shown him the door?
He wouldn't even have got to the door. He's one of the most notorious journalists in Britain and has been for a quarter of a century. I mean, it would be almost funny that the BBC had employed him as head of religion if it wasn't so obscene. But other people who have been interviewed by Martin Bashir have complained that he lied to them. And we know that the BBC wrote a formal letter to ITV about Martin Bashir's conduct on several stories. So I think that both BBC and ITV need to look at all his scoops, because what Martin Bashir and some of those around him did was mistake getting a scoop at all costs for proper, decent, ethical journalism.
Dorothy, let me put this to you. You are pretty robust about Martin Bashir's record. Martin Bashir might say, if he were watching this, well, of course they'd say that. They didn't get the story, so of course they're going to try to bury me.
Martin Bashir can say that if he wants. I would rather not have a story than get a story by lying. Proper investigative journalism should never be confused with lying to get a scoop. A scoop is not the be-all and end-all of journalism. That's, if I may say, a terribly male attitude towards journalism. You know, journalism is about careful and forensic investigation of the type that we saw in the Panorama last week, which exposed Martin Bashir. Yes, one looked at that interview and thought, it's amazing that he got that interview. But that's actually one of the problems with Martin Bashir. On several occasions, other journalists have thought, how on earth did he get that scoop? How on earth did he persuade that person to do that interview? And that is what we must now see investigated.
Dorothy, this story is really just in part about Martin Bashir. The bigger issue, I guess, is about the BBC. Do you think the time has come for the BBC to stop being able to mark its own homework?
Well, the BBC no longer marks its own homework in the way that it did more than 25 years ago. It's now properly regulated by Ofcom, and I think that Ofcom is a good regulator. And from all over the world, people come to the United Kingdom to look at our system of regulation because it is so good. And it's because it's so good that we have very high levels of trust in British television journalism. And particularly during this pandemic, we've seen, Ofcom itself has revealed these figures, very high, even higher than usual levels of trust in television journalism. So we mustn't assume that the public doesn't trust journalists.
It is worth pointing out, though, that those very Ofcom figures that you're quoting put the BBC at the bottom of the Trust League, 10 points behind Sky, 8 points behind your own Channel 4. Do you think that this system of regulation, though, has been shown to be, at best, inadequate? Do you give any credence to the proposals, for example, from Lord Grade, that there should be an editorial board of experienced journalists who can spot the signs of this kind of thing going on, which, you know, the BBC's Board of Governors, the best will in the world, full of people who don't do journalism, would never be able to see?
At the time that this happened, the BBC was regulating itself. It is now, quite recently, moved to a new system where it is regulated in the same way that the rest of us are. The idea that yet another committee of so-called experienced blokes is going to make some difference, I don't give much credit to the idea that the problem with men is more men. I think that the regulator that we now have is good. I do think that one reason that the BBC has fallen just slightly in these tables of trust is the relentless attack on it in newspapers, which I think would affect people's attitudes towards it. But I've never worked for the BBC. I've never wanted to work for the BBC. I've always regarded it as an arrogant organisation of posh white blokes. And that's what we saw happen in that, in this scandal, how those men covered the traces. But it is a very good organisation, and the journalists are good.
You will be familiar with the phrase that it's not the crime that really killed you, but it's the cover-up. And I wonder, your equivalent at the BBC, who later became Director General, Tony Hall, did what Dyson has described as a pretty weak and feeble investigation. What do you imagine was going through the minds of BBC management when they allowed this to happen? Do you think, having been at that level of responsibility, how do you think this actually took place?
I cannot see into the mind of that man. I think there is a great arrogance there, isn't there, in that institution, certainly at the time, that they thought they didn't need to be transparent. You know, there's a moment when you discover something bad has happened in your organisation and you need to gird your loins and fess up to it. It's happened to me in my career that bad things have happened in the organisation, and what you have to do is admit it. There's an arrogance about the fact that the BBC didn't admit it at the time. And I think that was partly the culture, and that there were too many similar types of people, overwhelmingly men, running that organisation. And it shows me that we need greater diversity in the higher management of organisations in our country.
The BBC's got a new boss, Tim Davie, who was responsible for publishing this Dyson report. What would he need to do to satisfy you that the BBC has done enough to make sure that nothing like this, and I include the cover-up, by the way, could happen again?
For me, it's important that the BBC should also inquire into how Martin Bashir ever came to be the head of religion. And it's important to me that they should look at the other stories that he did at the BBC. And they should cooperate fully with Ofcom when they receive complaints. I think they do behave better now. Indeed, I recently made a complaint to Tim Davie myself about the BBC, and he responded.
Wow. Well, I bet he's pretty terrified after this. Thank you very much, Dorothy Byrne.
Thank you.
Following humiliation in Hartlepool, Labour will choose its candidate for the by-election in Batley and Spen today. Senior figures on both the left and the right have publicly called for Sir Keir Starmer to resign if they lose. And at least one big beast, Labour's King of the North, Andy Burnham, has reluctantly let everyone know that if called upon, he is ready to serve. I'm joined now by the former Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. John McDonnell, let's get one thing out of the way first, if we might. Jeremy Corbyn is still a member of the Labour Party and a member of Parliament, but he is not a Labour MP because Keir Starmer removed the whip. Is it time for him to be readmitted to the Parliamentary Labour Party?
Yes, it is. It is. Keir, when he was elected leader, said that he'd unite the party, and that's why he received such overwhelming support when he was elected leader. And one step in demonstrating he is uniting the party is to give Jeremy back the whip. I think most of us can't believe that he had the whip withdrawn in the first place when he was allowed to be a party member. So yeah, I think it'd be a really helpful act if Keir did that now.
Do you think it would genuinely unite the party? I mean, do you think that some of the members of Parliament who have accused Jeremy Corbyn of enabling anti-Semitism might feel a bit too soon, don't you think?
Well, I think it would be one small step in uniting the party. And I actually do think now's the time to move on. Jeremy is, look, he's a Labour Party member. He's had no disciplinary action taken against him. So there's nothing holding back, therefore, in having the Labour whip restored. So I just think it's time to move on now. And it would be just one small step of Keir saying, look, that I'm fulfilling the promise I gave to party members of uniting the party.
All right, well, let's look at the future. Your friend and colleague Diane Abbott said this week, Keir Starmer faces another by-election in the coming months in Batley and Spen. If Labour loses again, it must surely be curtains for him. I imagine you agree, don't you?
Well, I followed the Tony Benn line, you know, which it's about policies, not personalities. And I think you can add to that, it's also about the narrative as well. So the issue isn't about Keir, it's about the future of the Labour Party. And what we have to do now is
I am going to come to policy, John. I am going to come to policy, okay, John, but come on. I've known you as a straight shooter for many, many years. You don't duck questions. Do you agree with Diane or not?
I don't get into the personality issue. I never do. And I actually always work on the basis that we should have a political debate about the direction of the party, and that should never rest upon one individual, one person. This is about the whole of our movement. That's why I never get dragged into that sort of thing.
But Diane's point is not about whether Keir Starmer's nice or nasty. The question is whether he can win for Labour and put you back into power to do the things that you're about to tell me you want to do. So, I'll try one more time. So do you agree with Diane that if he loses at Batley, that is a clear signal that the best service he could provide for the party is to step down?
See, it always gets back to the political programme. It never is about individuals. This is an issue the whole movement has got to face about how we go forward and what political programme that we can turn the fortunes of the party around upon and give the Labour Party actually and the country a sense of purpose. It's never down to an individual. That's why, exactly like Tony Benn, I never get dragged into comments about individuals. It's about the movement as a whole.
All right, well, your colleague in the movement, the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, did go to the issue of Labour's programme, and what she says is nobody knows what it is. She said that on the doorstep, people did not know what Keir Starmer stood for. Let's take the personality out of it, but what she's saying is nobody knows what the Labour Party is about, right?
Well, that was a valid criticism. It was a valid criticism. When Keir got elected leader, he did say, yes, I'll unite the party, and he did set out a basic 10-point programme. And that doesn't seem to be where he's at the moment. So the message to the party overall is that you can't go on the doorstep and fight in elections. And then when people, so you can criticise the government, but then when people ask the question, well, what would you do? You haven't got an answer. So the key issue for us now is consolidating where we go forward, how we're going to give the Labour Party a sense of purpose again, how we're going to give the country a sense of purpose again. And what Keir said when he was elected leader is that he'd use the last manifestos as the sort of foundational documents upon which to build upon. No one expects him to follow slavishly past policies. Of course you don't. In fact, the past policies now, I think, we do need to radicalise them and go further. So therefore, we should have had it already, but we should be having now the policy debate about where we go forward, what's our policy programme, what's the narrative, what's the vision of the society that we want to create. Keir's now launched a policy review, so that's going to be the focal point for that debate. So at least now we're moving towards it. I just think, I know we've been tied down with the COVID pandemic, but the last 12 months should have been used to that effect. You know, even in the Second World War, there's lots of references that even Johnson makes to the Second World War. Even during the Second World War, at our lowest point, progressives and socialists were dreaming and discussing and planning the society that we want to create. That's what we should have been doing. That's what we need to do now.
Indeed. So let's come to that, John, because what I think you've just told me is that what Labour now has to do is to come up with a programme that is even more left-wing than the one it put forward in 2019. So
Trevor,
you're going to advise
Trevor,
Keir
listen
Starmer.
to my words.
Let me finish my question.
Okay,
you're going to advise Keir Starmer. What are the top three things that you're going to say, Keir, these are the things that the people need to know that Labour stands for?
Okay. Trevor, Sophie Ridge set a very good high standard for this programme. I think you should stick to that standard. What I said was not left-wing.
Let's not get tetchy here.
Well, let me just say to you, when you interview someone, don't put words in their mouth. What I said, a more radical programme, you can interpret that as left or right or whatever. The reason we need to be more radical is because we're facing in this country an existential crisis of climate change. We're coming through COVID, hopefully, and we're coming through COVID, but we're still faced with the same problems of grotesque levels of inequality and poverty. We've seen today that last year more billionaires were made in this country than in the last 30 years, and yet in my constituency and elsewhere, we're having families struggling just to make sure they can put food on the plates for their children. Low pay, insecure work, lack of housing, public services underinvested. Even our public servants who saved lives during this crisis are now faced either with a pay freeze or a pay cut. But the existential threat of climate change is what we have to face up to now. That's the next big crisis that we face. So what I'd be saying to him, of course we have to tackle immediately these problems of inequality, low pay, insecurity, poverty in our society, but recognise rushing towards us now is the threat of climate change, and that means just dramatic and radical change in our economy and the way in which we live.
In the interest of keeping up the high standard of journalism, this programme, I've let you set out what you think the problem is. What I asked you before was, what are the things that you will advise the party leader to be Labour's policies that will define Labour?
Okay.
Name one, two things.
Let's go through them. Immediate action now to tackle poverty. That means a fair taxation system where we redistribute wealth in this country. Full stop. That's it. Secondly, making sure that when people go to work, they earn a decent wage. And that means, yes, a pay rise for the nurses, the 15%, ending the pay freezes, restoring trade union rights, and then the Green New Deal to tackle climate change. They're the three elements that I want to see now, that we actually provide the basics so that people can have a decent quality of life, they can be properly paid, they have a reasonable income, a roof over their heads, put food on the plates so they can feed their children, all of that. But above all else, a Green New Deal now to tackle the climate change threat.
Do you think that the vision that you're putting forward, which involves more spending, and, you know, let's be clear, left, right, more radical, whatever you call it, you've been pretty clear, which is one of the things that I think people most admire about you. Do you think there's a problem for Labour? The Tories have borrowed billions and they're running a huge deficit. They're promoting the policy that you put forward 2019 on broadband. This week, by the way, they nationalised the rail network. Do you think that there's a problem that for the Labour Party that Boris Johnson's standing a bit to the left of Keir Starmer right now?
What we've got to do is cut through the rhetoric of the Tories and look at the substance. Take rail, for example. This isn't nationalisation. What they're doing is they're leaving the rail in private hands so profits can go to the private sector, but all the risks flow then to the public sector. So it's not the plans that we put forward, certainly. In fact, it looks as though we're going to be ripped off even more by these private companies. But again, look at the levels of investment that they're talking about. They can no longer argue that we can't afford it. They can no longer argue that the resources aren't available.
Okay.
Because when we're in the COVID crisis, we found the resources. We're now facing the biggest crisis ever, the threat to our very existence. So if the resources need to be found, they will be found. And you know, that's what's happening right the way across the world. Look at what Biden is doing in America. He's finding the resources. He's bringing forward a plan to tackle climate change. And the other policy, you know, that we should get on board with is the Biden policy of making sure that the whole world, the whole globe is vaccinated. So we take on the big pharmaceutical companies, make sure that they no longer using patents and the other forms of legal devices to prevent the technology and information going to the global south. Those are the sort of purposes now that we should be swinging behind. And you know, this country could lead on many of these things.
John, incredibly bold. I hope we'll be talking more about these policies in times to come. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
That's it for now. After the break, we'll be discussing the crisis in the Middle East.